Hattie O'Malley didn't cry when the last man turned his back on her. She'd used up every tear she had on the steamboat from Chicago, somewhere between hope and humiliation. She stood in the Montana mud, while 9 other women were claimed one by one, like bolts of good fabric at a dry goods sale. The crowd was laughing. She could hear it open ugly without apology. And then the laughter stopped. Heavy boots hit the ground behind her. A voice low as a thunderhead rolling off the Rockies said, "I'll take her." If this story already has your heart subscribed to this channel, hit that notification bell and follow Hattie's journey all the way to the end. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. The matrimonial wagon had rolled into Black Hollow just before noon on the hottest Tuesday in July, and by the time it stopped in front of the Mercantile, half the town had already gathered. Word traveled fast in a place this small. 10 mail-order brides from back east, the notice had said. Respectable women, hard-working, ready to settle. The men of Black Hollow had been waiting 3 weeks for this wagon, and they weren't shy about showing it. They lined up along the boardwalk with their hats in their hands and their boots freshly oiled, nudging each other, making jokes, trying to look like they weren't desperate when every last one of them was. Hattie O'Malley sat in the back of that wagon and knew exactly what was about to happen. She wasn't naive. She hadn't been naive since she was 19 years old, and her mother told her plain as bread and water that a woman who looked like Hattie would have to work twice as hard for half as much. Not cruel, just honest. Her mother had been a practical woman. Hattie had tried to be one too. She was 31 years old. She was heavy, not pleasantly rounded, not softly curved the way the ladies' magazines described it, but genuinely, undeniably large. Wide through the hips, full through the chest and middle, with arms that strained the seams of her second-best dress, the blue calico she'd worn because she thought the color was kind to her complexion. She had a good face, she knew that. Strong jaw, clear gray eyes, dark hair that curled at the temples when the humidity hit it. But a good face didn't weigh much against everything else in a lineup of 10 women on a wagon, not when the men doing the choosing were looking for someone to share a bed and a breakfast table and 30 years of hard frontier life. Hattie had told herself on the long ride out from Chicago that she was prepared. She'd told herself it on the steamboat and on the stagecoach and in every sleepless night in between. She was prepared. She was not prepared. The first woman chosen was Clara Booth, small, blonde, quick smiling, and she was claimed before she'd fully descended the wagon steps. A tall farmer in a red shirt took her hand, and they shook on it like a business arrangement, which Hattie supposed it was. The second went just as fast. Then the third. By the time the fifth woman stepped down, Hattie had stopped watching the men's faces. She'd started watching the remaining women instead, the nervous ones, the hopeful ones, the one in the green dress who kept smoothing her skirts with trembling hands. She focused on them because looking at the men meant seeing the moment their eyes passed over her, and that moment had a particular quality to it that she did not want to study too closely. It was not hatred. It was worse than hatred. It was the brief, involuntary flinch of a man looking at something he did not want and then looking away as though the looking itself had cost him something. 6, 7, 8, 9. The woman in the green dress. Her name was Pauline. Hattie had learned on the journey, was chosen last by a wiry man with a sunburned neck who shook her hand without meeting her eyes. Pauline shot one look back at Hattie as she stepped down. Not unkind, just helpless. And then the wagon was empty, except for Hattie O'Malley sitting on the bench with her carpet bag on her knees and the July sun pressing down on her like a hand. The silence lasted about 4 seconds. Then somebody laughed. It started with one man she didn't see, who a short bark of amusement that cut right through the heat. And then another voice picked it up, and another, and within moments the whole crowd had that looseness to it, that ugly communal pleasure that happens when people find something to laugh at that isn't them. "Reckon they ran out of takers," someone said loud enough to carry. "Shipped all that way for nothing." Another voice. A woman's this time, which was somehow worse. "Lord Almighty, you'd think they'd have warned the fellas in the letter." Hattie sat very still. She set her jaw. She looked at a fixed point on the far side of the street, a water trough green with algae, unremarkable and permanent, and she breathed through her nose, and she did not let her face do anything she would regret. The wagon driver, a weathered man named Pruitt, who'd been pleasant enough on the journey, cleared his throat. "Miss O'Malley," he said not unkindly. "You'll want to, the agency says if you ain't matched today, they'll arrange passage back to—" "I heard you, Mr. Pruitt." Her voice came out level. She was proud of that. She stood up. The wagon rocked. She gathered her bag and she climbed down the steps with the same deliberate care she'd climbed up them that morning in Chicago. Because dignity, she had decided long ago, was not something other people could take from you. They could laugh. They could look away. But they could not reach inside her chest and pull out the part of her that refused to fold. Her boots hit the mud, thick black July mud, the kind that sucked at your heels, and she straightened her spine and looked at the crowd. They were still smiling. Most of them. A few had the decency to look elsewhere. "Fine entertainment," Hattie said to no one in particular. "Hope it was worth the trip." That got a few more laughs, but different ones. Uncertain. Less comfortable. She'd wrong-footed them slightly, and she knew it, and she held on to that small thing like a coal in a cold wind. She was about to ask Pruitt where the nearest boarding house was, because she was not getting back in that wagon. Not for any amount of agency money. She would scrub floors in Black Hollow before she rode back to Chicago in defeat when she heard the boots. Heavy, unhurried, coming from the left from the direction of the livery stable at the far end of the street. The kind of footsteps that didn't speed up for anything or anyone, but covered ground all the same. The laughter ebbed. Not all at once, but gradually the way sound gets swallowed by a room when someone unexpected walks in. Hattie turned. He was tall. Genuinely tall. Not just compared to her, but the kind of tall that made you recalibrate the space around him. Dark hair under a battered hat jaw, shadowed with several days of beard, wearing a canvas work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and trail dust on everything. He moved with the particular economy of a man who'd spent most of his life outdoors, and had long since stopped performing anything for anyone. His eyes swept the street, cataloged the situation in about 3 seconds, and landed on her. He stopped walking. He looked at her, not the way the men in the lineup had looked at her. Not that quick dismissal, but looked actually and directly the way you look at something you're deciding something about. Then he looked at the crowd. Something moved in his jaw. "What's the joke?" he said. It wasn't a question. Nobody answered immediately. The man who'd made the first comment, Hattie located him now stocky somewhere in his 40s, leaning against the porch post of the hardware store, shifted his weight, but didn't speak. "Jeremiah." The tall man's voice was flat. "I'm asking you." Jeremiah straightened. It's just the situation, Cole. No takers for the last one. You know how it is." "No," Cole said. "I don't." He walked forward. The crowd did that thing. Crowds do when a certain kind of man moves through them. It parted, not hurrying about it, but parting all the same. He stopped a few feet from Hattie and took his hat off. Held it at his side. "Cole McAllister," he said. "I've got a mountain lodge 12 miles north. I came to town for supplies, not for this." He gestured vaguely at the wagon, the crowd, the whole sorry proceedings. "But I'm here, and it appears there's a woman who came a long way and deserves better than what she's getting." He looked at her with the directness she was already starting to recognize as just how his face worked. "If you're willing to hear terms, Miss O'Malley," Hattie said. "Hattie O'Malley. Miss O'Malley?" A nod. "I'm not a man who makes promises I don't intend to keep. What I can offer is a sound roof, fair work, and respect. Not poetry, just an honest arrangement." The crowd had gone very quiet. Hattie studied him. She was good at reading people. 31 years of navigating a world that had strong opinions about her body had made her very good at it, and what she read in Cole McAllister's face was not pity. She'd become an expert at identifying pity. It had a particular softness around the eyes, a careful deliberateness in the voice, that unmistakable quality of someone managing their own discomfort by being generous to you. This wasn't that. This was something more like assessment. The way you'd look at a situation that needed handling and decide you were the one to handle it. She wasn't sure yet whether that was better, but it was different. "You don't know me," she said. "No, ma'am, I don't." "I'm not—" She paused, chose the word carefully. I'm not looking to be somebody's charity case, Mr. McAllister. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but in the neighborhood of one. Didn't take you for one. From the crowd, a woman's voice, sharp social, the voice of someone accustomed to being listened to, cut in. Cole McAllister, you can't be serious. You don't even know what the agency's asking for her. She might not even be able to. Cole turned and looked at the woman. He didn't say anything. He just looked at her with those flat, patient eyes until the sentence died on its own. Then he turned back to Hattie. The offer stands, he said. If you need time to think, I'll be at the feed store for another hour. He put his hat back on. He looked at Pruitt. She'll need her trunk if she's got one. I've got two, Hattie said. The corner of his mouth moved. All right. He started to turn away, and Hattie heard herself say, not because she'd decided to, but because some part of her had already decided for her, I don't need an hour. He stopped. Terms, she said. You said you'd hear terms. I have some of my own. He turned back around. Waited. I don't cook meals I don't want to cook, she said. I don't make myself small so other people feel comfortable. I do my share of the work, and I expect mine acknowledged. And if this arrangement stops being workable for either of us, we part ways clean with no hard feelings and no blame. Those are my terms. The quiet in the street had a different quality now. It was the silence of people listening to something they hadn't expected to hear. Cole McAllister looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, Fair enough. Then I accept, Hattie said. Mr. McAllister. He nodded once, short, decisive, and turned to deal with the business of trunks and the wagon driver and all the ordinary machinery of a decision being put into motion. Hattie stood in the mud of Black Hollow's main street with her carpetbag in both hands and her heart doing something complicated and not entirely unpleasant in her chest. Jeremiah, still at his porch post, let out a long breath and said to no one in particular, Well, I'll be. Shut up, Jeremiah, said a woman near the dry goods store, and several people laughed, but different from before, smaller, somewhat ashamed of itself. Hattie didn't look at any of them. She watched Cole McAllister organize her trunks with the same unhurried efficiency he seemed to bring to everything, and she thought, I don't know this man. I don't know this town. I don't know what 12 miles north looks like or what kind of life is waiting at the end of it. But I walked off a wagon in the mud today, and I didn't fold. That was something. That was, in fact, everything. The road north was bad. Hattie had grown up in the city where bad roads meant cobblestones and ruts. She understood now that she had not previously understood the meaning of the word. The road, if it deserved the name, was more of an intention cut into the mountain's side, 2 wheel tracks through mud and rock, and the kind of overgrowth that didn't care about human plans. The wagon lurched and complained. The horse, a big roan named Dispatch, navigated it with an expression of professional resignation. Cole drove without commentary, which Hattie appreciated. She'd half expected questions. Where was she from? What was her family? What had she been thinking, signing up with a matrimonial agency? But he didn't ask any of it. He kept his eyes on the road and his hands easy on the reins, and let the silence be what it was, which was just silence. Not hostile, not awkward, just 2 people in proximity getting somewhere. After a while she asked, You always this quiet? Mostly, he said. That a habit or a preference? He considered it. Both, I reckon. She looked out at the trees, pine and fir, running right up to the edge of the road, the July light breaking through in long bars. The air was different up here. Cleaner. It had a smell to it she didn't have a word for yet. You came for supplies, she said. Not for a wife. That's right. Then why? He was quiet for a moment. The wagon hit a rock and shuddered. He steadied it without any visible effort. Because they were laughing, he said. And it wasn't right. It was the simplest answer she'd ever received to a complicated question, and for some reason it worked its way into her chest and sat there. She didn't say anything in response. She wasn't sure there was anything to say. About 4 miles in the road, narrowed to the point where the trees were brushing both sides of the wagon, and then they hit the mud. It wasn't gradual. One moment they were moving. The next the wagon had sunk to the axle on the right side, and Dispatch was pulling at nothing. Cole said one short word under his breath, not quite an oath, and set the brake. He climbed down and looked at the situation with the expression of a man who has encountered this problem before and found it irritating but not insurmountable. "I'll need to lever it," he said. "Grab the reins and keep him steady." Hattie was already climbing down from the other side. "I'll lever," she said. "You're heavier. More use on the horse." He looked at her across the back of the wagon. "You know how to lever a wagon?" "I know how physics works," she said. "And I know you're stronger, which means you can hold dispatch steady better than I can when the wagon moves. Give me the bar." He studied her for a second. Then he reached under the wagon seat and handed her the iron lever without further argument. She found the purchase point, worked the bar under the axle, and set her weight against it. It was hard, genuinely brutally hard. The mud had a grip like spite, and the angle was wrong. She adjusted, leveraged her body into it, all the weight she'd spent her whole life apologizing for suddenly being exactly the right tool for the job. "Now," she said. Cole clucked at dispatch. The horse surged. Hattie heaved. The wagon rocked, caught, and lurched up out of the mud with a sucking sound that felt briefly like a small victory over the natural order. They both stood there for a moment, breathing. "Huh," Cole said. "I grew up in the city," Hattie said, handing the lever back. "Didn't say I grew up helpless." He took the lever. He was looking at her with that assessing expression again, and this time she thought she caught something in it besides assessment. Something that might, given time and different circumstances, become something else. "No," he said. "I can see that." They got back in the wagon. The road opened up ahead of them, climbing through the trees, toward whatever waited at the top of 12 miles north. Hattie O'Malley settled her carpetbag on her lap, straightened her spine, and went to meet it. The lodge materialized out of the tree line the way things do when you've been traveling long enough that you've stopped expecting anything suddenly all at once without ceremony. Hattie didn't say anything when she first saw it. She took it in the way she took in most things she hadn't decided how to feel about yet. Quietly from the outside, cataloging details before committing to a reaction. It was bigger than she'd expected. Solid. The kind of structure that had been built by someone who intended to stay. Cole pulled dispatch to a stop and set the brake. "Home," he said. Not proud, not apologetic, just the word. "It's solid," Hattie said. "Built it myself. 6 years ago." He climbed down. 7, maybe. Time moves different up here. She climbed down on her own side before he could come around to help her, and she stood in the dirt yard and looked at the lodge the way she'd learned to look at most situations she was about to commit herself to, straight on without flinching. A porch ran the full length of the front. 2 windows on the upper level. A woodpile stacked to the eave on the north side with the kind of disciplined precision that told her something about the man who'd stacked it. A kitchen garden running along the eastern wall, slightly overgrown in the July heat, but not abandoned. Someone had been out here recently pulling weeds, tying up the climbing beans. "You've been managing the garden yourself," she said. "Mostly." He was unhitching dispatch with the automatic ease of someone who'd done it 10,000 times. "I'm better at keeping things alive than I am at making them flourish. There's a difference." Hattie looked at the beans, looked at him. "Yes," she said. "There is." He led the horse toward the small barn without looking back, and she picked up her carpetbag and walked up the porch steps alone, which felt right. She wasn't the kind of woman who waited to be escorted through doors. The inside of the lodge was clean, in the way that working men's spaces are clean. Functional, unsentimental, cleared of anything that didn't earn its keep. A long table, 4 chairs. A stone fireplace that took up most of the north wall. Shelves of canned goods and tools, and she noticed books. More books than she'd expected crammed into the shelves with no particular order, spines cracked and pages bent from actual reading. She put her bag down on the table and pulled out the nearest book. A survey of Montana territorial law published 1871. She put it back, pulled out another. A dog-eared copy of a Dickens novel, the spine so broken it fell open to the middle of its own accord. She was still holding it when she heard his boots on the porch. "You read Dickens," she said when he came through the door. He glanced at the book. "My mother sent it. Didn't seem right to leave it unread." "Your mother sent you Bleak House." She had opinions about lawyers. He hung his hat on the peg by the door with the ease of long habit. "Thought it was instructive. Hattie looked down at the pages in her hands. She sounds like a sensible woman. She was. Past tense. Brief. He moved past her toward the kitchen end of the room. There's a room upstairs the left door. It's yours. I sleep in the back room down here. I'll want to put my things in order before anything else. Take your time. He was filling the kettle from the water pitcher on the counter. Are you hungry? I can manage my own supper, she said, then paused, recalibrated. But if you're already making something, I won't say no. The silence that followed had a slightly different quality than the silences on the road, less new, more like the beginning of a rhythm. He put the kettle on. She set the Dickens back on the shelf. They moved around each other in the kitchen space, with careful, courteous attention to where the other person was. And it wasn't graceful yet, but it wasn't awkward either. It was the first hour of two strangers learning the geography of sharing space, and Hattie had enough self-awareness to recognize that it mattered that the first hour almost always set the tone for everything that followed. She intended to set a good one. 3 days passed. They weren't easy days, not hard in the brutal physical sense, but full of the friction that comes from two people with established habits, trying to make room for each other without negotiation. Cole had a system for everything: the firewood, the water, the morning feeding of the horse, and the 3 chickens he kept in a wire pen beside the barn. He didn't explain the system. He just moved through it, and Hattie watched and figured it out and slotted herself in where it made sense. On the second morning, she rearranged the kitchen shelves. Not drastically. She moved the flour to a lower shelf where it was easier to reach, reorganized the canned goods by type, instead of by whatever system had put the beans next to the lamp oil, and relocated the large cast iron skillet from a nail on the far wall to the hook directly beside the stove. Cole came in from the barn, looked at the shelves, and said nothing. She waited. The flour was up there because the sack leaks, he said finally. The shelf below has a crack. Then we should repair the crack, she said. Or replace the sack. He considered this. The crack needs a proper patch. I've been meaning to get to it. I noticed a piece of pine board in the barn that would do the job. Another pause. I know the one. I could do it myself if you'd rather use your time on something else. He looked at her then, that long taking stock look she was getting used to. You know how to patch shelves. I know how to learn things I need to know, she said. Hand me the board and point me at the tools. He didn't argue. He got the board. By the end of the afternoon, the shelf was solid. The flour was where it belonged, and something between them had shifted not dramatically, not in any way she could have pointed to and named, but shifted all the same. Like a door that had been sticking in its frame, suddenly moving freely. That evening, after supper, Cole sat down across from her at the long table with 2 cups of coffee, and pushed one toward her and said, Where'd you learn to use a level? My father ran a hardware store in Chicago, Hattie said. He had 3 daughters and no sons. He taught us all the same things. Practical man. Practical family. She wrapped her hands around the cup. My mother taught me to cook and keep accounts. My father taught me to fix things. I always thought the combination was more useful than either one alone. Cole nodded slowly. You keep accounts. I kept the books for my father's store for 8 years, until he sold it. Why'd he sell? She looked at her coffee. He died. My mother sold it. Different question. I'm sorry, he said. Just that. No excess of condolence, no performance of sympathy. Just the 2 words meant plainly. It was 3 years ago, she said. We've all found our footing since. This. She made a small gesture that encompassed the lodge, the mountain, the whole situation. This was my way of finding mine. He nodded again. He drank his coffee and looked at the middle distance and didn't push for more, which was exactly the right thing to do, and she found herself revising upward her initial estimate of him. On the 4th morning, the letter arrived. Cole had ridden down to the trading post at the base of the mountain, a trip he made once a week, apparently for mail and certain supplies, and came back with 2 crates, a bundle of newspapers and an envelope that he set on the table in front of Hattie without a word, then went to see to the horse. The return address on the envelope read, Crow Mineral Enterprises, Billings, Montana. Established 1874. Hattie looked at it. She did not touch it. When Cole came back inside, she said, Do you want to tell me about this, or should I wait until you've had coffee? He looked at the envelope. His jaw did a thing. Crow, he said. That's what it says. He sat down, picked it up, opened it with the direct, no-nonsense motion of a man who'd rather know bad news than wonder about it. He read it. His face didn't move much, but his hand went flat on the table in a way that Hattie recognized as the physical equivalent of taking a breath. What does it say? She asked. He turned it and set it in front of her. The letter was formal typed on good paper, and it said in the careful language of men who employed lawyers to make aggressive things sound reasonable that Crow Mineral Enterprises had identified significant mineral deposits on and adjacent to the property held by one Cole McAllister in the northern Montana Territorial Range, and that said company was prepared to make a generous offer for the purchase of the land, and that they hoped Mr. McAllister would see the wisdom of accepting same as the mineral survey had been filed with the territorial government, and certain legal proceedings were already underway to establish right of access in the event that a voluntary agreement could not be reached. Hattie read it twice. Then she set it down and said, "How long has this been going on?" 6 months, Cole said. First letter came in February. I didn't answer it. Did you think that would make it go away? Something passed across his face, not quite embarrassment, but in the same county. I thought it might. It didn't. No? He stood up, walked to the window. There's silver on the eastern ridge. Everybody up here knows it. Crow's been buying land all along the range, some of it fair, some of it not. 3 of my neighbors sold in the winter, 2 didn't. What happened to the 2 who didn't? He was quiet for a moment. Hank Pruitt's barn burned down in March. They said it was an accident. Ed Calhoun's water rights got disputed in court by a man Ed's never met, who somehow had documentation that Ed's family filed in the original territorial claim was deficient. Hattie sat with that. You have documentation for your claim. I have what I filed. Original deed signed and recorded in the territorial office in Helena. 7 years of tax payments all receipted. He turned around. But Crow has lawyers. I have a deed. You have a deed and 7 years of tax payments which establishes continuous habitation and good faith ownership under territorial law, Hattie said. That's not nothing, Mr. McAllister. That's actually quite a lot. He looked at her. You know territorial land law. My father had a land dispute when I was 14. He couldn't afford a lawyer, so he learned the law himself. I helped him research it. She paused. He won. Cole was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not the assessing look, not the careful courtesy of the first days. Something more open than either of those. Something that looked briefly like relief. I need to see your original deed, she said, and every piece of documentation you have. Every tax receipt, every letter, every survey reference. Where do you keep them? There's a tin box, he said, in the back room. Get it. He got it. They spent that evening at the table with papers spread between them and 2 lanterns burning, and Hattie read everything twice and asked questions, and Cole answered them. And then she asked more questions and he answered those too. And somewhere in the 3rd hour of it, she realized that she had forgotten entirely to feel like a stranger in this house. The deed was good. She was certain of it, as certain as someone without a law degree could be, which was more certain than Cole had been an hour ago, and that was something. The tax receipts were complete. The original survey was on file in Helena. There were some weaknesses, a gap in 1 year's filing, an ambiguity in the eastern boundary description that a clever lawyer could worry at, but the foundation was solid. The eastern boundary, she said, pointing. This description references a rock formation as a landmark. Is it still there? The formation? Yes. Been there longer than people have. Good. We need to document that. With witnesses who can attest to the landmark's continuity and your consistent use of the eastern ridge as part of your property. She looked up. Do you have neighbors who've known you long enough? The Halverson family has been here since before I built. 8 years, maybe 9. Are they the kind of people who'd stand up in court? Cole thought about it. Agnes Halverson would stand up to a grizzly bear if she had something to say to it. Hattie almost smiled. Good. We'll want to visit them. We, he said. She looked up from the papers. Unless you'd rather I stayed home. He held her gaze for a moment. No, he said. I wouldn't rather. She went back to the papers. He watched her for a moment. She could feel it, and then he pulled a sheet toward himself and started reading where she pointed. They worked in the lamplight until the candles burned low, and when they finally put the papers away and banked the fire, the night had gone deep and quiet around the lodge. At the bottom of the stairs, Cole said, "Hattie." She stopped. He almost never used her first name. "Thank you," he said, "for taking this seriously." She turned and looked at him in the dim light. "It's serious," she said simply. "Of course I took it seriously." She went up to her room. She lay on the bed in the dark and listened to the mountains settle around her, and thought about the letter on the table downstairs, and Crow Mineral Enterprises with their lawyers and their filed surveys, and their Billings address, and the way Ed Calhoun's water rights had been disputed by a man he'd never met. These were not men who gave up because you didn't answer their letters. These were men who had decided somewhere in a comfortable office far from the mud and the pine trees and the silver in the eastern ridge that Cole McAllister's home was already theirs. They'd just not yet gotten around to collecting it. She thought about Cole's face at the table tonight. The way relief had moved through it when he realized she knew something useful. The way he'd handed her documents without question, answered every question without defensiveness, worked beside her through 3 hours of paperwork, without once suggesting that this was his problem and she was overstepping. She thought about the wagon in Black Hollow, and the mud, and the crowd's laughter, and the way he'd said simply and finally, because they were laughing, and it wasn't right. This was not a man who needed saving. But it was possibly a man who needed a partner, not someone to stand behind him, someone to stand next to him. Hattie O'Malley had spent her whole life making herself useful in rooms where she wasn't wanted. For the first time in longer than she could comfortably remember, she was in a room where she was. She closed her eyes. Outside, the mountain was dark, and the pines moved in a wind that came off the high peaks, and somewhere on the eastern ridge, silver lay in the rock, like a secret waiting to be argued over by men in suits who had never once put their weight against a lever and pulled. She was up before dawn. Not because she had to be. Cole's morning started early, but he'd never once suggested she match his schedule, and she appreciated that. But because she'd slept as long as her mind would allow it, and her mind had already moved on to the next problem. She built the fire and put the coffee on, and pulled Cole's documentation back out of the tin box and sat with it at the table in the gray pre-dawn light, and went through it again slower this time, looking for the things she'd been too tired to see the night before. She found one. It was in the original filing receipt from the Helena Territorial Office, a hand-stamped entry in the margin faded, but legible. A secondary annotation indicating that the claim had been cross-referenced against a prior survey request by a party whose name had been partially obscured by a water stain. She couldn't read the name, but she could read the date. 1873. Cole had filed his claim in 1876. Whatever that prior survey was, it had been there first. And if Crow's lawyers were clever, and everything about this situation suggested they already knew about it. She was still staring at the annotation when Cole came in from the barn, looked at her, looked at the papers, and said nothing. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down across from her. "What did you find?" he said. She turned the receipt around and pointed at the margin notation. He looked at it for the long moment. "I never noticed that." "It's faded, easy to miss." She kept her voice even. "Do you know who might have surveyed the Eastern Ridge in 1873? He thought. His coffee sat untouched. "There were some prospectors through here that year, before the silver was confirmed. I heard about them secondhand. I wasn't here yet. Some of them filed speculative claims that went nowhere. If one of them filed a survey and it's still on record in Helena," Hattie said, "Crow could buy that filing and use it to argue prior claim to the eastern boundary." The silence stretched. "That's what they're doing," Cole said. His voice had a flatness to it that she was starting to recognize as his version of controlled anger. "That's exactly what they're doing. We don't know that yet. I know these men," he said. "I know how they operate. This isn't new Hank Pruitt. Ed Calhoun. This is the same play run twice already." He stood up. "They buy old claims from prospectors who need money and don't ask questions about why a mining company wants a 30-year-old survey filing. Then they walk into a territorial court with a piece of paper that's older than your deed, and they say, 'Look, we were here first.' Then we need to go to Helena," Hattie said, "before they do." He looked at her. "Helena is 4 days' ride." "I know." The roads right now with the summer rain. I know that too. She held his gaze. And I know that if Crow has already filed a legal proceeding every day, we wait as a day they're further ahead of us in a courthouse where they know the judges, and we don't. She paused. Do we go, or do we hand them the Eastern Ridge on a silver platter? No pun intended. Something moved through his expression, the closest thing she'd seen yet to a real unguarded moment. It might have been the beginning of a laugh. No pun intended, he repeated. I'm serious, Mr. McAllister. Cole, he said. If you're riding 4 days to Helena to save my land, you can call me Cole. She looked at him across the table with the morning light coming through the window, and the papers spread between them, and the coffee going cold in both their cups. All right, she said. Cole. He picked up his hat from the table where he'd set it when he came in. He turned it in his hands, once the way she'd noticed he did when he was thinking through something. We leave tomorrow morning, he said. Early. I'll pack tonight. He nodded and stood and put his hat on and walked toward the door, and then stopped with his hand on the frame and said without turning around, You've been here 5 days, Hattie O'Malley. I know. You already know more about my property claim than I do. You've been busy keeping things alive, she said. You said yourself that's different from making them flourish. He stood there a moment longer. Then, Yeah, he said. I did. He went out. The door closed behind him. Hattie sat in the morning light with her cold coffee and her papers, and her heart doing again that complicated thing it had been doing since a man in a dusty hat had walked through a laughing crowd in Black Hollow and decided that what he was seeing wasn't right. She pulled the document with the margin notation toward her and looked at the water-stained name she couldn't read, and she thought, I am going to find out who you are. And then I am going to make absolutely certain you cannot be used to take this mountain away from the man who built his life on it. She started a list. They left before the sun was fully up with the tin box of documents wrapped in oilcloth in Cole's saddlebag, and 4 days of provisions split between 2 horses. Hattie rode a gray mare named Constance that Cole had borrowed from the Halverson farm the evening before, after a visit that had gone better than she'd expected and worse than she'd hoped. Agnes Halverson had been exactly what Cole described, a small, iron-spined woman in her 60s, who looked at Hattie with the frank assessment of someone who had sized up strangers all her life and had strong opinions about what she found. She'd shaken Hattie's hand like a man and said, So you're the one from Chicago. And Hattie had said, I am. And Agnes had said, Good. Cole needs someone who can read, which was apparently the highest compliment she offered because her husband Lars had looked quietly impressed by it. They'd agreed to provide a written statement about the eastern boundary landmark and Cole's consistent use of the ridgeland for 7 years. Lars had produced, unexpectedly, a hand-drawn map from 1874 that showed the rock formation and noted Cole's property line in his own cramped handwriting. It was exactly the kind of document a territorial judge would find credible. Hattie had held it in both hands and tried not to look as relieved as she felt. But Agnes had also said quietly at the door when Cole was already outside, You know about the Crow man they've got in Helena, the one who's been talking to the land office clerk. And when Hattie said she didn't, Agnes had looked at her with those flat knowing eyes and said, Fellow named Stills, Tobias Stills. He's the one who finds the old filings and makes them useful. Been doing it for Crow for 3 years. They say he's got a contact inside the land records office who'll adjust things if the money's right. Hattie had kept her face still. Do you know that for certain? I know Ed Calhoun's original water rights filing disappeared from the records office for 2 weeks, Agnes said. And when it came back, there was an amendment on it nobody remembered writing. So that was the shape of it. Not just aggressive lawyering. Fraud. Active purchased corruption in the territorial record system, which meant that whatever they found in Helena might not be what had actually been filed, and whatever they brought with them might find itself mysteriously altered before a judge ever saw it. Hattie had thought about that all through the packing and most of the sleepless hours before dawn, and she was still thinking about it now. 2 hours into the road south with Constance moving steady beneath her, and Cole riding a length ahead the way he always positioned himself on a narrow track. Not from habit, she'd decided, but from the instinct of a man who'd spent years making sure the space in front of him was safe before he let anyone else into it. Tell me about Tobias Stills, she said. Cole looked back at her. Agnes told you. Agnes told me. Tell me what you know. He was quiet for a moment, letting the horses pick their way around a stretch of rocky ground. Stills came through this range 2 years ago, said he was a surveyor working independent doing historical documentation. Wanted to look at the old claim records in the county filing office. Black Hollow has a sub-office for the Northern Range claims. He paused. I let him look. Hattie went still in the saddle. You let him look at your records. They're public documents. He had a right to request them. He did. She kept her voice measured. What did he see? Everything in the sub-office file. The original deed, the survey reference, the annual tax filings. His voice had that controlled flatness again, including the 1876 claim registration, which would have had the cross-reference annotation. So he knew about the 1873 survey. He found it before I even noticed it was there. She rode with that for a moment. The weight of it. Cole, that was 2 years ago. They've had 2 years to acquire whatever that 1873 filing was and build a legal case around it. I know. Which means we may already be behind them in Helena. I know that too. She pushed Constance up alongside his horse. Then why do you look like you still think we can win this? He glanced at her sideways. Because I've got the truth on my side. And you. It was the most direct thing he'd said to her yet. She felt it land somewhere in her chest and stayed with it for a moment, not examining it too closely, just letting it be there. Don't put too much weight on me, she said finally. You reorganized my kitchen shelves on the second day and patched a shelf on the third and read 7 years of legal documents by lamplight on the fourth, he said. I'll put exactly as much weight as seems warranted. She had no answer for that. They rode in silence for a while, and the morning opened up around them, and Hattie thought about Tobias Stills and land office clerks with flexible ethics and 2 years of careful preparation by men with money, and she thought, we need more than the truth. We need to be smarter than they are. She started working through it in her head, the way she used to work through her father's account books. When something didn't add up, not panicking, not rushing, just methodically pulling at the threads until the picture clarified. What did they have Cole's original deed? Tax receipts 7 years unbroken. The Halverson statement, and Lars's 1874 map. The oilcloth-wrapped tin box with every document Cole had ever filed. The margin annotation that indicated a 1873 survey possibly bought by Crow. Agnes's testimony not yet in writing about the 2 weeks Ed Calhoun's file had gone missing. What did Crow have? A 1873 survey filing probably purchased from whoever had filed it. Lawyers who knew the territorial court. A contact inside the land records office who could apparently adjust documents. And 2 years of preparation. The balance was not favorable, but it was not impossible. She turned it over and over in her head while the miles fell away beneath them. They stopped the first night at a way station that was more barn than inn, run by a taciturn man named Fowler, who charged 50 cents for a stall and $1 for a room and provided meals that were nourishing, if not memorable. There were 2 other travelers, a drummer going south with a case of sample goods, and a young man who said nothing and ate fast and disappeared to the barn immediately after supper. Cole watched the young man go and said quietly to Hattie across the table, Been behind us since the Halverson turnoff. Hattie set down her fork. You're certain? Same roan with the white left forefoot. I noticed it in Black Hollow 2 days ago outside the feed store. He didn't look up from his plate. He's not a very good follower. Crows. I'd guess. She looked toward the barn door, then back at Cole. So they know we're going to Helena. They'd have expected it once they sent the letter. The letter was a test, see whether I had anyone who could read what it actually meant. A pause. They know now. Hattie thought about that. Then going to the land records office first might not be the right move. If he telegraphs ahead, he will. Then we need to see someone else first. Someone who can pull the 1873 survey record before Stills knows we're in the city. Is there anyone in Helena you trust? Cole was quiet for a long moment. He cut a piece of bread. There's a man named George Parrish. He was my father's lawyer years ago. Retired now, but he knows the territorial land law better than anyone alive, and he knows the judge who handles mineral claims. He paused. I haven't spoken to him in 4 years. What happened 4 years ago? Nothing dramatic. I stopped going to Helena and we lost contact. A beat. He sent a letter when my father died. I didn't answer it. Hattie looked at him. He was looking at his plate with the careful attention of a man not looking at something. You didn't answer a lot of letters for a while, she said. No. Quiet. I didn't. She understood in that moment a little more about the solitude of the mountain lodge and the books on the shelf and the careful maintained distance from things that might require emotional expenditure he hadn't had to spare. She didn't say any of that. She just said, "Would Parrish see you if you showed up?" Yes, Cole said. He'd see me. He's that kind of man. Then that's where we go first. Before the land records office, before the courthouse, before anyone else in Helena knows we're there. She looked at him steadily. And we do it before our friend in the barn can get word to Stills. Cole looked up from his plate. That look again, the one she'd started to recognize as the open, unguarded version of his face, the one that didn't happen often. How? We leave 2 hours before dawn, she said. Give his horse a slow start. He was quiet for a moment. Then, how? She looked at him across the table. Do you have a penknife? They left at 3 in the morning. The young man's roan, when he eventually saddled it the next day, would find its left shoe slightly loosened, not pulled, not enough to lame the animal, but enough to require a careful walk to the nearest farrier before it could be pushed to any kind of speed. Hattie had learned that trick from her father, too, who'd had the occasion once to slow down a man following him home from a late night at the store. Practical families produced practical knowledge. She was grateful for it. They rode hard through the pre-dawn dark and into the gray morning and into a bright afternoon, and by the time they saw Helena's rooftops below them against the July sky, they were half a day ahead of anyone who might want to race them there. George Parrish lived in a house on the east side of the city, narrow-fronted and tidy, with a garden that showed the same dedicated attention to keeping things alive that Hattie had noticed in Cole's kitchen garden. An old man answered the door, compact, silver-haired, with the kind of face that has spent decades making fast assessments of situations and people. He looked at Cole. He looked at Hattie. He looked at the oilcloth bundle under Cole's arm. Come in, he said without preamble. You'll want coffee. They sat in his study for 3 hours. Parrish read every document twice, asked questions in the precise, unhurried manner of a man who had learned to make sure he was asking the right question before he opened his mouth and took notes in a small leather book. He sent his housekeeper out twice once for records he had in an office across the city once for a name that Hattie didn't catch. At the end of the 3 hours, he set the papers down and looked at Cole and said, You should have answered my letter. Cole held his gaze. I know. The 1873 survey was filed by a man named Horace Webb, Parrish said. Prospector. He filed 6 claims that year and found nothing on any of them and gave up by 75. The filing lapsed under the non-development statute. He paused. It should be inactive. Should be, Hattie said. Parrish looked at her. He'd been looking at her with increasing attention throughout the 3 hours, and she'd felt him recalibrating his estimate of her the same way she'd done with Cole. You're right to stress that phrase, Miss O'Malley. Crow filed a revival petition on the Webb claim 8 months ago, under a provision that allows a dormant mineral claim to be revived if the original filer or their legal successor demonstrates renewed development intent. How did they establish succession from Webb? Hattie asked. If he's been gone for 20 years. They found his daughter, Parrish said. She's alive apparently in Cheyenne. Signed a transfer of interest to a Crow subsidiary for, he looked at his notes, $200. Hattie sat with the precision of that. $200 for 20 years of dormant claim. A woman in Cheyenne who probably didn't know what she was signing. Lawyers who'd found her before Cole had any reason to know to look. 2 years of preparation. She'd been right. Is the revival petition valid? Cole asked. Parrish made a so-so gesture. It's technically within the statute. Whether it supersedes your active claim and continuous habitation is a question for a judge. He paused. A judge who has received 2 substantial donations to his re-election campaign from the Crow Family Charitable Foundation in the past 18 months. The room went quiet. Cole's hand went flat on the table. Hattie said carefully, Tell me about the land records clerk. Parrish looked at her sharply. You know about that? Agnes Halverson told me about Ed Calhoun's file. The 2 weeks it went missing. The amendment nobody wrote. Parrish stood up and walked to the window and stood there with his hands behind his back for a long moment. The clerk's name is Morton. He's been in the records office for 12 years. He has 2 children at the territorial school and a wife who takes in sewing to make ends meet. He turned around. He's not a bad man. He's a desperate one. Crow identified that distinction and made use of it. If Morton altered Ed Calhoun's file, Hattie said, there may be evidence of the original. Carbon paper, a draft, something he didn't fully destroy. Parrish looked at her steadily. That would require someone to approach Morton directly, which if Crow has him watched, and they likely do, would be noticed. Not if the person approaching him doesn't look like they're approaching him, Hattie said. Not if it looks like an accident. Cole turned and looked at her. Hattie, Morton has 2 children in school, she said. The territorial school is public. Anyone can walk in. You want to talk to a records clerk through his children. I want to give a desperate man a reason to do the right thing before this goes to a judge who takes money from the people he's helping, she said flatly. Do you have a better idea? The silence held for a moment. Then Parrish made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and sat back down and said, I always told your father you needed someone who could read, Cole. I didn't know I meant it literally. Cole looked at Hattie, the open, unguarded version of his face, something in it that she didn't examine too closely because now was not the time. Be careful, he said. I'm always careful, she said. No, he said. You're always competent. That's different. Be careful. She held his gaze for a moment. All right. The territorial school let out at 3 in the afternoon, and Hattie was standing near the gate when it did, holding a paper bag of penny candy she'd bought from the general store down the street, which was the kind of thing a friendly woman might hold near a school gate without arousing any particular suspicion. Morton's children were a boy of about 9 and a girl of maybe 7. Parrish had described them. The boy had a gap in his front teeth. The girl wore her hair in 2 braids. Hattie spotted them in 30 seconds. She didn't approach them directly. She let them go past, noted which direction they walked, and followed at a distance that was not a following distance, just a woman going the same direction on a public street. 3 blocks from the school, the boy dropped his slate. It skidded across the boardwalk and fetched up against Hattie's boot. She picked it up and handed it back. There you go. Thank you, ma'am. Gap-toothed smile. Polite child. Morton had raised polite children. Hattie filed that. You're welcome. She glanced at the slate which had his name on it in the corner, a child's careful printing. Thomas Morton is your father. Richard Morton at the Land Records Office. The boy looked at her with the cautious assessment of a child who'd been told not to talk to strangers, balanced against the natural desire to confirm that yes, he was who he was. Yes'm. I thought so. I worked with your father years ago before you were born. She kept her voice warm and easy and entirely untruthful. He was always such a careful man, very principled. She smiled at the children. You tell him Margaret says hello. He'll know who I mean. She handed the girl a piece of candy from the bag. Just one. And she asked the girl first, which the girl appreciated, and she walked on. The name Margaret. The word principled. If Morton had a conscience, and Parrish thought he did, and Parrish was a good reader of people, those 2 words together would work on him. The fiction of a woman who remembered him as principled. The implication that someone was watching who remembered what he used to be. It was not a guarantee. But it was a seed. The seed bore fruit faster than she'd expected. At 7 o'clock that evening, there was a knock at Parrish's front door. The housekeeper opened it and came back with a folded note and a look of cautious curiosity. The note was addressed to no one. It said, I still have the original. I kept it because I was afraid to destroy it. If you can protect me and my family, I will give it to you. Come alone to the church on Prospect Street tomorrow at 6 in the morning. Ask for Father Connolly. Tell him you're there about the matter of conscience. Hattie read it twice, passed it to Cole. He read it and looked at Parrish. He kept the original, Hattie said. Whatever they had him alter, he kept the original before he altered it. Parrish sat back in his chair with the expression of a man who has seen many things in his career and is revising his estimate of how this particular situation was likely to resolve. If that's Calhoun's original water rights filing unaltered, and if we can get Morton to testify about what he was asked to do and by whom, it changes everything, Cole said. It changes the landscape, Parrish said carefully. It doesn't change the judge. One problem at a time, Hattie said. She looked at the note in her hand and thought about a man who had done a wrong thing and hadn't been able to make himself destroy the evidence of the right thing. A man who had kept one piece of paper because some part of him had not been ready to be entirely what Crow had paid him to become. That piece of paper might save Cole's mountain. That piece of paper might save Ed Calhoun's water. That piece of paper might be the thread that pulled carefully and steadily unraveled 2 years of Crow Mineral Enterprises' carefully constructed legal fiction. Hattie set the note on the table and straightened her spine, and looked at Cole across Parrish's cluttered study, and he was already looking at her with that expression that she was running out of reasons not to name. "Get some sleep," she said. "Both of you. Tomorrow's early." She went to bed in Parrish's spare room and lay in the dark and listened to the city sounds outside the window so different from the mountain sounds she'd already gotten used to, and thought about principled men and desperate ones, and the difference between them, and how sometimes the difference was just one piece of paper kept in a drawer because a man couldn't quite bring himself to be entirely lost. She understood that. She'd spent 31 years keeping her own piece of paper, her own private proof of who she was, beneath what the world had decided about her in a drawer no one else could open. She closed her eyes. Tomorrow at 6, everything would either move forward or fall apart. She was not going to let it fall apart. Father Connolly was a small Irish priest with careful eyes who opened the church door at 6 in the morning without surprise, as though people arrived at his door before dawn regularly and he had made his peace with it. "The matter of conscience," Hattie said. He looked at her for one long moment. Then he stepped back and let her in. Morton was already there, sitting in the third pew from the front, turned sideways with his hat in both hands and his shoulders carrying the particular shape of a man who had not slept. He was younger than Hattie had expected, mid-30s slight, with the kind of face that would have been pleasant under different circumstances. Right now it was the face of someone who had been frightened for a long time, and had reached the point where the fear of staying frightened had finally outweighed the fear of doing something about it. Hattie sat down beside him without ceremony. "You kept the original filing," she said. "Yes." His voice was barely above a whisper. "Where is it?" He reached into his coat and produced an envelope folded once and held it in both hands without giving it to her yet. "I need to know my family won't be hurt. I have a retired territorial lawyer who has agreed to take your testimony and petition for prosecutorial protection," Hattie said. "His name is George Parrish. He was practicing law in this territory before Crow Mineral Enterprises existed. He knows the right people, and he knows how to do this quietly." She looked at Morton directly. "I can't promise you nothing hard is coming, but I can promise you that the man Parrish knows in the prosecutor's office has been looking for exactly what you have in that envelope for 2 years." Morton looked at his hands. "They paid me $300, he said, "in 2 installments. The second payment came after I made the change." He swallowed. I want you to know it wasn't something I decided easily." "I believe you," Hattie said. And she did. She wasn't in the business of making men feel better about things they'd done wrong. But she was in the business of being accurate. And the accuracy here was that Richard Morton was a man who had made a bad choice under genuine pressure, not a man who had made it easily or without cost. "My wife doesn't know," he said. "She doesn't need to," Hattie said. "Not from me, not from Parrish." She paused. "But Morton, if this goes to court, and it will go to court, there are going to be questions you can't avoid. The best thing you can do for your family right now is be the man who came forward, not the man who got caught." He sat with that for a long moment. Father Connolly at the front of the church was demonstrably not listening, which was its own kind of grace. Then Morton held out the envelope. Hattie took it. She didn't open it there. She put it inside her coat against her body the same way you'd carry something irreplaceable. "Parrish's address," she said, and gave it to him. "Be there by 9. Come the back way if you're worried about being followed. She stood. You did the right thing keeping it. You're doing the right thing now. He looked up at her. You're the woman Cole McAllister brought to the mountain. She paused. Word travels. Black Hollow's not that far, he said. I heard about it. The wagon. He stopped. People talked. They tend to, she said. I just wanted to say. He turned his hat in his hands again. What you're doing here for him, not many people would. Hattie thought of the mud in Black Hollow Street and the sound of a crowd finding something to laugh at. She thought of Cole's boots on the boardwalk and the way the laughter had stopped. He did the same for me, she said simply. We're even. She walked out of the church into the early morning, and Cole was there leaning against the wall outside with his arms crossed and his hat pulled down, and when he saw her face, he straightened. He had it, she said. Cole closed his eyes for one brief second. The Calhoun filing. The original unaltered. She patted her coat. He's coming to Parrish at 9. Cole looked at her for a moment. Then he reached out and gripped her arm briefly above the elbow. Not romantic, not performative. Just the solid pressure of a man making contact with something he needed to confirm was real, and said, All right, let's go. I should. Parrish read the original filing with the focused attention of a surgeon examining a wound, and when he was done, he set it on the desk and said, The alteration is clear. The original establishes Calhoun's water rights as predating any Crow subsidiary claim by 11 years. The amended version, the version currently in the Land Records Office, changes the date of first use and removes a witness signature that would have been dispositive. Can you prove the amendment was made after the fact? Hattie asked. The ink color is slightly different. The handwriting in the amended section is demonstrably not Morton's regular hand. He writes a clerk's script very regular, and the alteration is cramped. A document examiner would confirm it in an afternoon. Parrish looked up. And now we have Morton's testimony, which is more valuable than the ink. Cole was standing by the window. He had his arms crossed and his jaw set, and he hadn't said much in the last hour, which Hattie was starting to understand meant he was thinking hard rather than shutting down. The judge, he said. You said the judge took money from Crow's foundation. That I know of, Parrish said carefully. I cannot prove it directly. What I can tell you is that Judge Hartwell has ruled in favor of Crow-related interests in 4 out of 4 relevant proceedings in the past 2 years. Can we get a different judge? On what grounds I'd need to file a recusal motion which requires demonstrable evidence of bias or conflict. He paused. What I have is circumstantial. What I have, said a voice from the doorway, might be less circumstantial. They all turned. Morton was standing in the doorway of Parrish's study 2 hours earlier than expected, with his hat in his hands, and a second envelope that he was holding, the way people hold things they've finally decided they're done carrying. He walked in and sat down and put the second envelope on the desk. There were 2 payments, he said. I told you that. $300. What I didn't tell you, what I didn't say to anyone ever, was that the second payment came with a letter. He looked at Parrish. From Hartwell's clerk. The room was absolutely silent. The letter specified the filing amendment, Morton said, in the clerk's handwriting, with a reference to a case number that's currently on Hartwell's docket. His voice was steady in the way that voices are steady when someone has made a decision they've been building toward for months, and the making of it is almost a relief. I kept that too. I don't know why. I kept everything. Maybe I always knew it was going to end here. Parrish opened the second envelope and read the letter inside, and his face did something complicated and controlled, and finally settled into the expression of a man who has just been handed a tool he has needed for a very long time. This is the clerk's signature, he said. Yes, if Hartwell's clerk is directing the alteration of land records to align with pending cases on Hartwell's docket, that is not circumstantial evidence of judicial corruption. He looked at Morton. That is direct evidence. I know. You understand what happens next. The prosecutor's office, the territorial governor possibly. This goes well above a land dispute. I know, Morton said again. His voice was tired, and something else lighter than tired. I've known for a long time what it was. I just needed... He stopped. He looked at Hattie. I just needed someone to make it possible to do the right thing without it destroying everything. Hattie thought of something Agnes Halverson had said. He's not a bad man. He's a desperate one. She thought about the difference between those two things and how small it was and how important. You should call your wife, she said. Before this moves forward, she should hear it from you. Morton nodded. He stood. He looked 10 years younger and 10 years older at the same time. Is there a, can I use your? Parrish gestured toward the hall. Morton went. The three of them sat in the study, in the particular silence that follows something large. Then Cole said, it's still 2 days until the hearing. Crow's lawyers are still filing. The revival petition on the Webb claim is still active. Yes, Parrish said. But now we go to the hearing with Morton's testimony about document alteration and a letter from Hartwell's clerk that makes the entire case look like what it is. He picked up the letter again. I'll be requesting an emergency review by the territorial prosecutor this afternoon. I'll be filing a motion to transfer the case out of Hartwell's courtroom by end of day. And I'll be submitting Cole's documentation along with Lars Halverson's map and statement as evidence of continuous good faith ownership. He looked at both of them with the expression of a man surveying a changed battlefield. The hearing may be delayed, it may be moved, but I no longer believe it will go against you. Hattie exhaled. She hadn't realized she'd been holding her breath. Cole looked at her. You got all this from a bag of penny candy, he said. I got all this from a man who wasn't as lost as he thought he was, she said. The candy was just the door. Done. The next 36 hours moved in the particular compressed way that high-stakes time moves, where hours feel like minutes and decisions feel like miles. Parrish filed the motion to transfer. The territorial prosecutor, a blunt-spoken man named Aldous, who had apparently been building a file on Hartwell for the better part of a year, received Morton's testimony with the controlled enthusiasm of a man who had been waiting for exactly this. By 6 o'clock the first evening, Hartwell had been notified of the recusal request. By 8 o'clock, word had apparently reached Crow's head lawyers because Parrish received a visit from a man in a good suit who described himself as a representative of mutual interests and suggested that a negotiated settlement might be in everyone's benefit. Parrish showed him the door with the courteous finality of a man who had been showing bad faith actors the door for 40 years and found it no less satisfying for the repetition. Cole and Hattie ate supper in Parrish's kitchen that evening, the two of them alone while Parrish was in his study, writing filings, and it was the quietest meal they'd shared since the lodge. Not uncomfortable quiet, the opposite. The kind of quiet that happens between people who have been through enough together that the silence has its own texture. What happens to Morton? Cole said. Parrish thinks the prosecutor will give him full protection in exchange for testimony. His cooperation makes the whole case. Hattie turned her cup in her hands. He'll probably have to leave Helena, find a new position somewhere. But Aldous made it clear he's got no interest in prosecuting a records clerk when he's got a judge and a mining corporation in his sights. Good, Cole said. He came forward. That should count. It does. She paused. People do wrong things and then they carry them. And sometimes if someone makes it possible, they do the hard thing. She looked at her cup. That's not nothing. That's actually a lot. Cole was quiet for a moment. You sound like you know that from somewhere personal. She looked up. He was watching her with the steady attention she'd come to rely on, without quite meaning to the kind of attention that didn't flinch and didn't judge, just looked and waited and gave whatever you said the dignity of being actually heard. My mother, she said after a moment. When my father died and she sold the store, she made a business decision that pushed out one of his employees, man named Ferris, who'd been there 12 years. She did it because she needed the money from the quick sale. She'd told herself she'd make it right later. She paused. She never did. I watched her carry that for 3 years. Not because Ferris came after her, he never did. Just because she knew. Did she ever? She found him eventually. Sent him a letter and some money. 2 years before she died. Hattie looked up. He wrote back and said thank you. That was all. But she had changed something in her face. Even from just a letter. Even that late. She set her cup down. Morton will feel that, when this is done. Cole nodded slowly. He was looking at her with something in his face that had been building for days. She thought something that had been accumulating. The way weather accumulates slowly, and then all at once. And she knew it was there, and she knew what it was, and she had been choosing deliberately not to look at it directly, because direct examination had consequences, and she was not sure she was ready for the consequences. He said, "Hattie." "Don't," she said. He was quiet. "Not yet," she said, and her voice was even. "When this is done. When we're back on the mountain, and this is resolved, and there's space for it. Then." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once, with the deliberate respect of a man who understood the difference between what he wanted and what the moment called for. "All right," he said. They finished supper. They washed their own dishes without being asked. They said goodnight at the foot of the stairs with a formality that was not distance, but containment. And Hattie went up to her room and sat on the edge of the bed and pressed both hands to her face and took a slow breath. She had not felt this way since she was young enough to feel it without fear. The fear was still there, old practiced armored fear, but for the first time in longer than she could name, something was louder. She let herself feel it for exactly 1 minute. Then she got up and washed her face and took out her notes and went back to work. The hearing, when it finally happened, was nothing like the courtroom dramas Hattie had read about in newspapers. It was moved as Parrish had requested to the courtroom of Judge Eleanor Voss, a territorial appointment from 2 years prior, who had the reputation of a woman who read every document placed before her and had strong feelings about people who wasted her time. The hearing room was plain and smelled of wood polish, and the July heat, and it was smaller than Hattie had imagined, and the whole thing took 4 hours rather than the days she'd braced for. Parrish presented Cole's documentation, first deed tax receipts, the Halverson statement. Lars's 1874 map with the boundary notation, the continuous habitation record. He presented it methodically and without drama, building the foundation the way you build a wall, one solid course at a time. Crow's lawyers there were 2 of them, both younger than Hattie expected, and both very well dressed, presented the Webb revival petition and the assignment of interest from Webb's daughter. They were smooth and prepared and confident in the particular way of people who have not yet received bad news. Then Parrish introduced Morton's testimony, the original unaltered Calhoun filing, and the letter from Hartwell's clerk. The confidence left the room like air from a punctured bladder. One of the lawyers said, "Objection, Your Honor. This evidence is—" "Sit down," Judge Voss said. She was reading the letter. She read it twice. She set it down and looked at the Crow lawyers with an expression that Hattie thought could etch glass. "Counsel," she said, "I am going to give you 30 seconds to decide whether you are personally aware of the conduct described in this document, because if you are, and you proceed without disclosing it, I will personally write to your professional board by end of week." The 2 lawyers looked at each other. The younger one went slightly gray. "Your Honor," the older one said, with the careful voice of a man recalculating rapidly. "My client had no knowledge of we were retained to pursue a legitimate—" 30 seconds began 40 seconds ago, Judge Voss said. "We withdraw the revival petition," the older lawyer said. "Pending review of our clients of the underlying. You're withdrawing." "Yes, Your Honor." Cole, sitting beside Hattie and Parrish at the plaintiff's table, went very still. She could feel it, not tension, but the physical experience of something that has been braced for a long time, suddenly not needing to brace anymore. "The revival petition is withdrawn," Judge Voss said to the clerk. "Note it. The original claim registration of Cole McAllister, filed 1876, stands as active and uncontested. His continuous habitation and good faith ownership are established in the record." She looked at Cole over the bench. "Mr. McAllister, your property rights are affirmed." The room was quiet. Cole said, "Thank you, Your Honor." She looked at him, and then at Hattie, and then back at the papers in front of her. "Thank your documentation," she said, "and whoever prepared it." Outside in the hall 10 minutes later, with the courthouse sounds going on around them, and Parrish shaking Cole's hand with the pleased satisfaction of a man whose faith in justice had been vindicated after a long wait, Cole turned to Hattie. She was looking at the courthouse floor because she needed somewhere to look that wasn't his face, not quite yet. "Hey," he said. She looked up. "It's done," he said. "It's over." She thought about the wagon in Black Hollow, and the mud, and the long road north, and the tin box, and the 4 days' ride, and Morton in the church pew with his hat in his hands, and Judge Voss's voice saying, "Your property rights are affirmed," and the way Cole had gone still beside her, the way you go still, when you've been holding something heavy for so long that setting it down takes a moment to believe. It's over, she agreed. He was looking at her in that way. The way she'd been not looking at directly. And they were standing in a courthouse hall in Helena, Montana, in July, with Parrish tactfully studying something interesting in the middle distance, and the door was open. She had said when this is done, it was done. "Cole," she said. "I know," he said. And the careful, unhurried man, who never rushed toward anything, took one step forward and took her hand, not dramatically, not as a gesture, but the way you take hold of something you have decided you are not going to keep at arm's length anymore. His hand was large and calloused and warm, and she looked down at it and then up at his face, and she thought, 31 years. 31 years of a world that had strong opinions about her body and her worth, and her right to stand in rooms and take up space and be chosen. And here was a man who had walked through a crowd of laughing people and said, "I'll take her not as charity, not as pity," but because he'd looked at the situation and found it unacceptable, and he'd looked at her and found something worth the looking. She tightened her hand around his. "Let's go home," she said. He nodded. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Let's go home." Parrish shook both their hands at the courthouse steps and told them to send word when they were settled, and to visit before winter, close the roads, and he looked at them together with the expression of a man who had known Cole McAllister for a long time, and was satisfied by what he was seeing. They walked to where the horses were tied and checked the cinches and mounted up, and Helena fell away behind them as the road north climbed into the afternoon. The July sky was enormous and clear. Constance moved with easy confidence under Hattie's hands. 4 days back. The same road. The same mountain at the end of it. Different entirely from the road they'd ridden south. Hattie rode and felt the sun on her face and the solid rhythm of the horse beneath her, and Cole riding a length ahead with the easy set of a man who knows where he's going, and she thought about the lodge and the kitchen shelves she'd rearranged, and the tin box sitting empty now on Parrish's table, and the beans climbing the east wall of the kitchen garden that had needed tying up since she'd arrived and kept getting set aside for more urgent things. She thought about the Halverson farm on the way back, and Agnes, who would need to be told. She thought about Ed Calhoun's water rights, which Parrish had said would be separately reviewed now that Morton's testimony was in the record. She thought about the neighbor whose barn had burned and whether there was anything left to do for him. There was a lot of work ahead. That had always been true. The difference was that now she was going back to a place that was, she realized, somewhere in the last 9 days without a single ceremony or formal declaration home. She urged Constance forward until she was riding alongside Cole, and he glanced over and said nothing because he didn't need to, and she said nothing because neither did she, and they rode north together under the wide Montana sky with the mountain waiting for them at the end of the road. They made the Halverson farm by the second afternoon with the light going gold and long across the fields, and both horses ready for water and rest. Agnes came out before they'd fully dismounted, which meant she'd been watching the road. Or someone had told her to watch the road, which in a community this sparse amounted to the same thing. She looked at their faces. She read them the way she read everything fast accurate without sentiment. "You won," she said. "We won," Cole said. Agnes made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a breath, and was entirely characteristic of a woman who has been carrying anxiety on behalf of someone she cared about and had just been allowed to put it down. She turned to Hattie and said, "Come inside. Lars made something decent for once, and there's coffee, and you're going to tell me everything." Lars, it turned out, had made a genuinely good venison stew, and they sat at the Halverson table for 2 hours, while Hattie laid out the whole story. Morton, the church, the letter from Hartwell's clerk, Judge Voss, and her glass-etching expression, and the 2 Crow lawyers going the color of old chalk. Agnes listened without interrupting, which Hattie suspected was unusual for her. Lars refilled the coffee without being asked. When Hattie finished, Agnes sat back in her chair and looked at her with the direct, unadorned assessment that Hattie had come to understand was Agnes Halverson's version of warmth. "You walked into a situation you'd been in Helena for less than a day," Agnes said, "and you found the one man who had what you needed and gave him a reason to hand it over." "He was already looking for a reason," Hattie said. "I just made it visible." "That's the harder part," Agnes said. "Anyone can hand a drowning man a rope. Making him believe he's worth pulling up, that's the work." Cole was watching Hattie across the table. She didn't look at him directly. She was getting better at not looking at him directly when she could feel the weight of it. "Your statement made the difference," Hattie told Agnes. "And Lars's map. Parrish said the boundary documentation was what established continuous habitation beyond dispute. Without it, even with Morton's testimony, there was room for argument." Lars, who had said approximately 40 words across the entire evening, said, "Glad it helped," and went back to his stew with the satisfaction of a man whose 40 words had been the right ones. Agnes refilled Hattie's coffee herself, a gesture Hattie understood to mean something in this household, and said quietly while Cole was talking to Lars about the road conditions north, "How are you doing? Not the legal business. You." Hattie looked at her cup. "I'm not entirely sure yet." "That's honest." "It's been 9 days, Hattie said. 9 days since I stepped off a wagon in Black Hollow and didn't fold. I'm trying not to run ahead of myself." "Running ahead of yourself isn't always the wrong thing," Agnes said. "Sometimes it's just called knowing what you want." Hattie looked up. Agnes was looking at her with the expression of a woman who had been married to a good man for 30 years and had strong opinions about not wasting time. "He's a careful man," Hattie said. "He is?" Agnes agreed. "He's also been alone on that mountain for 4 years waiting for something he didn't know he was waiting for." She picked up her own cup. "Don't make him wait too long after you've both had some sleep." Hattie had no answer for that. She drank her coffee and listened to Cole describe the Helena courthouse to Lars, and felt somewhere under the tiredness and the residual tension of 9 high-stakes days, something warm and settled and entirely new. They reached the lodge the following afternoon. Cole pulled the horses up in the yard, and they both sat for a moment without dismounting, looking at the place they'd left 9 days ago with a tin box of documents and a problem that had felt in certain dark hours of the Helena nights genuinely unsolvable. The lodge looked the same, the woodpile on the north side, the kitchen garden on the east wall with the beans still needing to be tied up, the porch running the full length of the front, solid, built by someone who intended to stay. "Still standing," Cole said. "Did you think it wouldn't be—" "No." He dismounted. "But it's good to confirm." She climbed down on her own side. Her legs were stiff from 4 days of hard riding, and she stood for a moment getting her balance, and when she looked up, Cole was already at Dispatch's head, running his hand down the horse's neck with the automatic affection of a man greeting something he'd missed, and Hattie thought, this is what belonging looks like. Not grand or performed, just a man and his horse and his yard, and the ease of being exactly where you're supposed to be. She wanted that ease. She acknowledged to herself already halfway into it. She took Constance to the barn and unsaddled her and brushed her down and made sure she had water and feed taking longer than strictly necessary because her hands needed something to do, and the rhythmic work of it settled the last of the road tension out of her shoulders. When she came out of the barn, Cole had already started a fire inside, and she could see the light of it through the window. She stood in the yard for a moment. 9 days ago, she'd stood in Black Hollow mud and looked at this man and thought, I don't know who you are or what 12 miles north looks like. I only know I'm not getting back in that wagon. She knew now. She knew what the lodge looked like in lamplight, and what his face looked like when he was angry, and what it looked like when something surprised him, and what it looked like at 3 in the morning in Parrish's study when he realized the case might actually be won. She knew he read Dickens and kept careful woodpiles, and had strong feelings about people who wouldn't answer letters, even when he himself had been one. She knew he was patient and direct and slow to trust, and that when he gave his trust, he gave it without reservation. She knew that she had given hers somewhere in the middle of all of it, without deciding to the way you sometimes make the important decisions not at a deliberate moment of choice, but in the accumulation of 100 small ones, each of which felt manageable on its own. She went inside. Cole was at the stove working on something practical and necessary, and he glanced back when she came in and said, "Sit down. You've been moving for 4 days." "So have you." "I'm not arguing. I'm just noting you don't have to stand." She sat down at the table and watched him move around the kitchen she'd reorganized with the flour on the lower shelf, now, and the big skillet beside the stove, and the domesticity of it was so ordinary and so quietly extraordinary at the same time that she had to look at her hands for a moment. "Cole," she said. Yeah. You said, when this is done, was when there'd be space for it. He went still at the stove. Not a tense stillness, a listening one. It's done, she said. He set down what he was holding and turned around. He leaned back against the counter and looked at her across the kitchen, with his arms loose at his sides. No hat, no performance. Just his face, and whatever was in it and what was in it was considerable. I'm aware, he said. I'm not a woman who needs poetry, she said. You told me that in Black Hollow, and it was the right thing to say, and it's still true. But I am a woman who needs to know where she stands. You stand here, he said. On this mountain, in this house, beside me. He held her gaze with the absolute steadiness she'd been relying on since the second day. That's where you stand, Hattie, if you want it. She took a breath. I want it. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and sat down across from her at the table and reached out and took her hand the way he had in the Helena courthouse, not dramatically, just the certain grip of a man who has decided. She looked at his hand and then at his face, and the tired, complicated, quietly extraordinary feeling in her chest reorganized itself into something cleaner. I have opinions about almost everything, she said. I know. I rearrange things. You rearrange them better, he said. I noticed. I'm not going to make myself small, she said. Not for you, not for Black Hollow, not for anyone. I know that too. His thumb moved across her hand, once brief and deliberate. Hattie, I watched you walk off a wagon in the mud and look a crowd of laughing people in the face and not fold. I'm not looking for someone small. I never was. She looked at him for a long, quiet moment. The fire crackled. Outside the mountain did its mountain things wind and pine in the deep settling quiet of elevation. All right, she said. All right, he agreed. And that was that. No fanfare, no performance. Just 2 people who had tested each other in the practical fires of 9 days and found what held, deciding to keep hold of it. 3 days passed in the comfortable work of coming home. There were things to be done, and they did them. The beans on the east wall got tied up. At last the water barrel on the north side needed resealing. The chicken pen had a loose board that had been loose since before Hattie arrived, and now got fixed properly. They worked side by side or in separate parts of the property as the work required, and the easy silence between them had changed in quality, not tense, not new, but settled. The silence of people who have said what needed saying and don't need to keep saying it. On the 4th morning, a rider came up from Black Hollow. Hattie saw him coming from the kitchen window and said, "Rider." And Cole came in from the barn, and they both stood on the porch when he pulled up. Young man, one of the Pruitt sons by the look of him, dusty from the road, and uncertain in the particular way of someone carrying a message, he's not sure how it'll land. "Mr. McAllister," he said, and then with visible adjustment, "Miss O'Malley, my mother sent me. She said you should know. Word came down from Helena that Judge Hartwell's been suspended pending investigation. And the Crow companies pulled back their filings on the Calhoun property, and the Pruitt claim, too." He paused. "My father's barn, the one that burned in March, Mr. Aldous from the prosecutor's office, sent word he's looking into it as part of the Crow investigation." Cole stood very still. "Your father know?" "Yes, sir. He—" The young man paused and pressed his lips together and did the brief internal work that young men do when they've been raised not to show too much. "He cried a little," he said. "My mother wanted you to know." The 3 of them stood there a moment, the morning air moving between them. "Tell your father," Cole said, "that I'll come down in a week when things are settled and we'll talk about the barn. There are men in the county who'll build for cost if we supply the timber, and there's good timber on my north ridge that's been due for clearing." The young man looked at him. "You'd do that." "Your family's been here as long as I have," Cole said. "That's what that means." The Pruitt son nodded, touched his hat brim to both of them, and turned his horse back down the road. They watched him go. Hattie stood beside Cole on the porch and thought about Hank Pruitt, crying in a house that had a gap where its barn should be, and the long chain of it, Morton's letter, Aldis's investigation, a judge-suspended filings withdrawn, and finally the small redemptive fact of a man finding out that what had been taken from him might yet be answered for. "The timber on the North Ridge," she said. "I've been meaning to clear it for 2 years. Good straight pine mostly. Waste to leave it." "You decided that just now." I decided it when I heard Hank's barn was gone, Cole said. I just hadn't figured out the mechanism yet. He looked at her. You always think things through before you decide, or just the big things? Both, she said. Depends on how fast the situation moves. What about this situation? Did you think it through? She looked at him standing beside her on his own porch, in his own yard, on his mountain with the morning light on his face, and the easy set of a man who had stopped bracing for the loss of the thing he'd built. I thought it through starting about the second day, she said. I just didn't say so until it was time to say it. He made a sound that was, she had come to understand his version of a laugh, not performed, not social. Just a brief, genuine exhale of something that had caught him pleasantly sideways. Good, he said. She went inside to start breakfast. He followed. The real test came on a Tuesday, 11 days after they'd returned from Helena, and it came in the form of a wagon from Black Hollow, carrying the town's self-appointed social conscience in the person of Ruth Carver, who was the wife of the hardware store owner, and who had, Hattie would learn later, been the woman's voice in the crowd that day at the matrimonial wagon. The one who had said loud enough to carry, she might not even be able to. Ruth arrived with 2 other women and a basket of preserves, and the kind of social smile that means something other than friendliness. And Hattie, who had been in the kitchen garden, came around the side of the house and stopped when she saw who it was. She knew the face. She didn't know the name yet, but she knew the face, and more than the face, she knew the quality of smile, the studied combination of generosity and assessment, and the faint hovering pleasure of a woman who has come to see how badly the situation she'd found amusing has resolved itself. Cole came out of the barn and took one look and came to stand beside Hattie with the quiet deliberateness of a man making a physical statement. Mrs. Carver, he said, polite, not warm. Cole. She climbed down from the wagon with her basket. We heard you were back from Helena. We thought we'd come welcome Miss O'Malley properly, seeing as how she arrived under such rushed circumstances. Her eyes moved over Hattie with the practiced efficiency of a woman cataloging details she intended to report later. Hattie looked at her. She thought of 31 years of rooms where she'd had to navigate exactly this: the smile that wasn't friendly, the welcome that wasn't warm, the studied graciousness that was really just a better-dressed version of the crowd's laughter. She thought about what she was now, not the woman left standing in the mud. Not the last choice, the unchosen one, the object of Black Hollow's communal entertainment. She was the woman who had ridden 4 days to Helena and found a records clerk in a church and unraveled 2 years of a powerful company's carefully built legal fraud, and stood beside Cole McAllister in a courtroom and watched his property rights get affirmed. She was the woman who had fixed the kitchen shelf and tied up the beans, and had Cole McAllister's hand in hers at the Halverson table, telling her where she stood. She was not interested in performing gratitude for a welcome that wasn't one. Mrs. Carver, she said. Her voice was pleasant and entirely steady. That's kind of you to come all this way. She took the basket without stepping back, without making room for more than the basket warranted. I'm sure you heard about the Crow situation being resolved. Cole's property rights are affirmed, and Hartwell's been suspended, and the families who were being targeted by those land grabs are going to get some accounting. It was a busy trip. Ruth's smile held but shifted. We did hear. It's yes, remarkable. It was a lot of paperwork, Hattie said. Fortunately, I'm good at paperwork. She smiled, and it was a real smile, which somehow made it more effective. Thank you for the preserves. Was there anything else you needed, or? We just wanted to call, Ruth said. Neighborly. Of course, Hattie said. Well, we're here and we're busy, but it's good to know the neighbors call. She looked at the other 2 women with the same warm, impenetrable cordiality. You're welcome to come again when we've had more time to settle in. She held Ruth Carver's gaze for one moment, not challenging, not angry, just clear. The gaze of a woman who knew exactly who she was and was done explaining it to anyone who didn't. Ruth Carver looked at Cole. Cole looked back with the expression of a man who was not going to help her with whatever she'd come here to accomplish. She looked back at Hattie. Something shifted in her face, not defeat exactly, but recalibration. The particular moment when a person realizes the ground they'd come to stand on isn't what they'd expected. Well, Ruth said, we'll let you get back to your work. They got back in the wagon. They drove down the road. The three of them watched them go. The third woman in the wagon, younger, who hadn't said a word the entire time, looked back as they turned out of the yard, and the look she gave Hattie wasn't anything like Ruth Carver's. It was something more like recognition, more like relief. Hattie filed that. There were women in Black Hollow for whom the sight of a woman who didn't fold might mean something. She intended in time to be worth that meaning. Cole looked at the basket in her hands. "Preserves," he said. "Strawberry, I think." She looked at the lid. "Yes, strawberry." "She makes good preserves," he said. "I'll give her that." "The preserves are not the problem," Hattie said. "No," he agreed. "They're not." He took the basket from her. "Come on, coffee." That evening, with supper done, and the fire banked and the mountain going dark around them, they sat together at the long table with the Dickens novel between them. She'd been reading it starting from the beginning, and the particular ease of people who had learned each other's rhythms and found them compatible. Cole was working on something with his hands, a repair to a harness buckle, and Hattie was reading, and neither of them needed to fill the silence. After a while, he said without looking up from the buckle, "You handled Ruth Carver well." "I handled her the way I've been handling women like that since I was 16, Hattie said, "with great patience and no ground given. That young one in the wagon, Millicent Hess, she's had a hard year." Hattie set the book down. "You know her. Her husband left in February. She's got a boy of 5 and her family's in Ohio." He worked the buckle with careful attention. "She doesn't have a lot of people looking out for her." Hattie thought about the look on the young woman's face as the wagon had turned out of the yard. Recognition, relief. "Invite her to call," Hattie said, "separately from Ruth Carver." Cole looked up from the buckle. "Yeah, she looked at me like—" Hattie paused, finding the right words. "Like she needed to see that something could work. For a woman alone in a hard place." She picked up the book again. "Invite her." He looked at her for a moment with that open version of his face. "All right," he said. "I will." He went back to the buckle. She went back to Dickens. The fire settled. And then he said quietly, without looking up, "I'm glad you didn't get back in the wagon." She looked up from the page. "In Black Hollow," he said, "when Pruitt said the agency would arrange passage back." He was still working the buckle hand steady. "I'm glad you didn't." She looked at him for a long moment. This careful, direct, solitary man who had walked through a crowd of laughing people on a hot Tuesday in July because he'd found the situation unacceptable and had ended up through the particular mathematics of character and circumstance, with her at his table and her books on his shelf, and her opinions about his kitchen arrangements and her hand in his at a Helena courthouse. "I wasn't going to get back in that wagon," she said. "Not for anything." He looked up then, the full, steady, open version of his face. "Good," he said. Outside the mountain was dark, and the wind moved through the pines on the eastern ridge, the ridge that was his, that was documented and affirmed and not going anywhere. And inside the fire gave its warmth to two people who had found each other in the mud of Black Hollow and had not once in all the hard and clarifying days that followed let go. Hattie O'Malley had come west on a matrimonial wagon to find a life worth living, and she had found something that surprised her in its wholeness. Not rescue, not charity, not a man who saw past her body to the acceptable woman beneath it. She had found a partner who had looked at all of her and said yes. That, exactly that. She had found a home on a mountain in Montana in the middle of summer, and she had built it herself with her own hands and her own mind and her own absolute refusal to fold, and it was going to last. That was not a small thing. That was, in fact, everything.